On a morning in May of 2014, a detective sat next to the hospital bed of a mortally injured 77-year-old woman. This woman had been in a coma for the last 10 days following a vicious attack on her. And in that time, the detective had been desperately working to try to figure out who had attacked her. But now, somewhat amazingly, the woman had woken up from her coma, and now this detective was finally getting the chance to ask the victim directly, "Who did this to you?" However, when the woman began to speak, this conversation would not go as planned. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please take the like button out for a beach day, but replace their sunscreen with cooking oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late in the afternoon on May 6, 2014, 77-year-old Helen Pastor sat at her office desk in Monaco with a phone pressed to her ear. And on the other end was one of Helen's many tenants, doing what they did best, which was to complain. This time there was a problem with their water heater, and apparently the plumber was late. And Helen, like she always did, listened patiently, because she was a landlord, and this was her job. But when this tenant was finished, Helen told them in a soft but firm voice that the plumber would be there eventually, and that they, the tenant, were certainly not too important to wait. Then she hung up. Helen knew her tenant wouldn't like this, but she also just didn't have patience for entitled, wealthy snobs. Unfortunately for her, though, she spent a lot of time with people like that, because Helen was actually the single richest woman in all of Monaco. So Monaco is a country located on the Mediterranean coast, and it's surrounded on 3 sides by France. And so Monaco and France share a lot of cultural similarities. But unlike France, Monaco is very, very small, just under a mile wide, and has only about 39,000 citizens. And many of those 39,000 citizens are incredibly wealthy. It's essentially a country of millionaires and billionaires living in ultra-luxury condos and high-rises all along its coastline. And Helen and her family, the Pastors, owned most of those condos, which meant they were among the wealthiest landlords not just in Monaco, but on the whole planet. The Pastors' multi-billion-dollar real estate empire had started 3 generations ago, and Helen was now in charge of it. It was a lot of work, and Helen could have passed it off to somebody else. But she was a Pastor, and Pastors worked for what they had, which was why, despite her wealth, Helen was a very hands-on landlord and spent long days in her office with her staff, dealing with accounting and handling tenants' requests and complaints, like about, the plumber not being on time. Now, Helen picked up the phone once more to make one more call before she left for the day, and this call was to her daughter, Sylvia. Sylvia was 53 and had been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years earlier. So Helen, naturally worried about her a lot and checked in with her daily. And on this day, when she heard her daughter pick up and say hello, Helen immediately asked her, how are you feeling? But Sylvia said she actually couldn't talk right now. Her massage therapist had just arrived, and so she excused herself and hung up. Helen took the phone off her ear and just stared at the receiver as the dial tone blared through it, doing her best not to feel hurt. Helen knew she was a very demanding parent and, generally was not particularly warm, but she loved Sylvia. And lately it seemed like her daughter just didn't necessarily reciprocate that. And Helen knew exactly who to blame for this. And it was not Sylvia, and it wasn't even Helen. It was Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Now, Sylvia had been with Wojciech for almost 3 decades, and it seemed like everyone in Monaco absolutely loved this guy. I mean, he was charming and gregarious and gave a ton of money to charity, but Helen had always felt like there was just something off about him, and she worried that he was taking advantage of her daughter's very famous name. And so generally, there had just been this sort of sitting, unspoken tension between Helen and Sylvia about Wojciech, the fact that clearly Helen didn't really like him, Like that tension was there between the mother and daughter, but lately it seemed like that tension had finally gotten to the point where, Helene and Sylvia were just having all these little arguments that, sometimes were actually about Wojciech and other times were about completely different things. It was like they were just quick to argue with each other. But for now, Helene looked at the time and saw, it was time to go. And so she stood up and she smoothed out her beautiful Chanel suit. And she knew that if she wanted to see her son Gildo tonight, she really needed to get a move on here. So Gildo, Helene's son, had been in the hospital for the last few months after having a stroke. Helene visited with him daily, making the 45-minute drive from Monaco to where he was hospitalized in Nice, France. Now, the daily commute was definitely a lot, but Helene didn't care. She always worked it into her very busy schedule. Now, Gildo was 47, but he was still very much Helene's child. And the whole ordeal had been just awful and very emotional for Helene, especially on top of, her daughter's cancer diagnosis and the tension between her and her daughter. Like, right now, life was pretty tough. Seeing her children like this had reminded Helene that money just could not save you from everything, even in Monaco. Now, Helene grabbed her Hermes purse and she headed out the door. Minutes later, Helene was outside and was climbing into a black minivan that was waiting for her at the curb. And as Helene slid into the back seat, she was greeted by her 64-year-old driver, Mohammed Darwich. So Mohammed had actually been working with Helene now for 15 years. And so the two of them spent the entire 45-minute drive to Nice just chatting about their kids, because in some ways they were, longtime friends. Mohammed told Helene about how he really missed his daughter, who lived back in Egypt with her mom. And he also updated Helene on his son, Wissam, and how he liked living in France. Their conversation made the drive go fast, and before Helene knew it, they were at the hospital. Around 6 p.m. that night, Helene was sitting at Gildo's bedside, helping him drink a glass of water. Like his mother, Gildo had been both blessed and cursed with the Pastor work ethic. Despite the family money, he was constantly starting ventures and investing in businesses. So Helene knew the hospitalization had been really hard for him, not just physically, but just from a work perspective. He was missing out on so many opportunities because he was stuck here. And even though now he was awake and alert, he was still partially paralyzed and just couldn't speak very well. Helene sat with Gildo for about an hour, talking to him and also checking in with his doctors. And then at some point, she kissed her son's forehead and told him she would see him soon. Just after 7 p.m., Helene walked out of the hospital to where Mohammed was waiting in the minivan. And this time, she got into the front passenger seat. And Mohammed, he started the car and they began to make their way out of the lot toward the busy streets of Nice. And pretty much right away, they got stuck in absolutely standstill traffic. And so Helene just sat back in her seat and tried to relax. But as she was doing that, something caught her eye outside of the car, like out her window. It was this person who had a hat kind of pulled down low over their eyes, and they were jogging right towards the minivan. And Helene, she just stared at this person and tried to see if they maybe knew them, because it did seem like they were coming right towards this car, like their car. But then she saw what this person was holding. And immediately she screamed at Mohammed to drive. But before Mohammed could react, Helene heard a loud bang and the sound of shattering glass. About 15 minutes later, the commissioner of the Nice police, Philippe Frison, pulled up to the hospital with the sirens on. He'd been in his office, about to finish up for the day, when he got a call about shots being fired, but he really didn't know how serious it was. So he parked and jumped out of his car, and the first thing he saw was a crowd of people gathered on the street across from the hospital. And they were all staring at this parked black minivan with Monaco plates and also a shattered passenger side window. Frison jogged over, and he was technically the first officer on the scene, but a firefighter standing by the minivan told him a few details based on what he'd seen and what the onlookers had been saying. Apparently, a man dressed in black had come out of nowhere on foot and fired 2 shots into the minivan, striking both the man and the woman who were in there in the head. The shooter had then disappeared back into the crowd, and witnesses saw a second man dressed in black follow after him. The firefighter said that both victims had been taken to the hospital in critical condition, but he didn't know, if they were still alive now, and he also didn't have any information on their identities, just that it was a man and a woman. Immediately, Frison's mind went to carjacking. Now, Nice did not have a huge amount of crime, but one of its more common issues was something called the car door grab, which was when criminals would target cars who were stuck in traffic, and they would rob these cars. And so he wondered if maybe carjackers had approached this vehicle and attempted to rob it. Something happened, they drew a weapon, and then obviously the victims inside were shot, and then the carjackers took off. And so Frison radioed back to the station for backup. A crime like this, whether it was carjacking or not, obviously what he's dealing with here is murder. A crime like this needed more officers than just him. And so he gets in touch with the dispatcher and he fills her in on the need for backup. And then during this discussion, she actually passes one more piece of information to Frison that she had recently learned. And that was the identities of the victims. And the reason that they already knew who these people were is because one of the victims was incredibly famous. The woman who had been shot was Helen Pastor. The other victim was her driver, Mohammed Darwich. When Frison heard this, he couldn't believe it. I mean, of course he knew who she was. Everyone in Monaco knew who Helen Pastor was, or at least had heard the Pastor name. And so now that Frison knew the identities of his victims, his theory of this case immediately changed. He felt like there was no way the richest woman in Monaco just happened to be targeted by random carjackers. This had to be a hit. And so Frison, after getting off the radio, went back to the minivan and just looked inside. And right away, he saw there was a purse that was sitting untouched on the dashboard, which made him even more certain that this was no robbery. Very likely that would have been grabbed. But then he noticed something else. The front seats and the floor of the minivan were covered in all these rounded metallic pellets, which he recognized as being from shotgun ammunition, like buckshot, like the inside of, what a shotgun fires or can fire. And this struck Frison as being very strange. A shotgun was an odd choice for a professional hit, because it was big and bulky and you really couldn't carry it in public without attracting a lot of attention. And so this, combined with the fact that this happened in broad daylight, told Frison that very likely whoever had shot Helen and her driver was not an experienced hitman, which was also just not what he would have expected. Just then, Frison heard the sound of sirens cut through the air, and he knew his backup had arrived. A few hours later, Frison was back at the police station talking to his team, which now included one of the city's very best detectives, investigator Catherine Massinio. Both of their victims, Mohammed and Helen, had survived, at least to this point. They were in comas, and their attack was already the leading news all around Europe. But Frison was not particularly worried about, potentially not being able to solve this, because he knew he would have some answers soon. Not only had their technicians processed the crime scene and gathered swabs and other evidence from the minivan, but also Frison's officers had found 2 security cameras near the scene that likely recorded the entire shooting. So in France, it was common for cities and towns to have like a network of closed-circuit surveillance cameras that law enforcement was able to access. And Nice had more of those cameras than any other city in the country. So Frison was optimistic about what the footage might show once it finally arrived. But in the meantime, he wanted to speak to Helen's immediate family and friends and see if she had any enemies. The way Frison saw it was, Helen's daughter and son, who she was very close with, Sylvia and Gildo, they would certainly know if there was anyone who wanted their mother dead. But Frison also knew that her children were not just potential sources of critical information. They were also suspects. Frison didn't have access to the details of Helen's estate, but he knew enough about the family to guess that whatever inheritance Helen left behind was literally in the billions, which meant that her death would likely make both Sylvia and Gildo billionaires. Now, Frison didn't think that either of them had actually pulled the trigger here, but what Frison did think was that both of them definitely had the motive and the means to hire somebody else to do the shooting. But Frison had one big problem. Sylvia and Gildo, and really all of the people he really wanted to speak to, lived in Monaco. And since Frison and his team were French, and this crime had happened in France, they had no jurisdiction in Monaco. So, in order to speak to Helen's children and her inner circle, they couldn't just walk up and demand an interview. Instead, they basically had to ask nicely. The next morning, Frison sat in a very expensive-looking living room overlooking the beautiful Monaco harbor. Now, Frison had been up all night and was basically running on fumes at this point, but he hoped, that was going to be worth it, because sitting across from him was Helen's daughter, Sylvia Pastor, and her 64-year-old boyfriend, Wojciech Janowski. When Frizon had reached out to Sylvia and Wojciech and asked them to speak with him, one, he had been sort of surprised at how quickly they had agreed to do it, but two, he sensed really not much emotion. Like they were sort of cold and detached and sort of quick to be like, sure, we'll meet up and chat with you about this, as if it was just no big deal. But now that he was face to face with them, it was clear that they were absolutely devastated. Especially Sylvia. Now, Frizon knew as much as he wanted to ask some sort of pointed questions here, he needed to be very careful because Sylvia and Wojciech did not have to be speaking to him at this point. Like, they basically are just agreeing to do this interview, and at any point, they can say, enough, leave, and he would have to go. So Frizon, when he began, he just started out with some very light background questions about Helen. And in a very shaky voice, Sylvia described her mother as being very tough, but incredibly generous. She said they did fight a lot, but it was just over silly things, and they were actually, pretty close. Sylvia said she'd been battling breast cancer, and her mother had always called to check in, like she really cared. When Frizon asked about enemies, Sylvia shook her head, and she said, obviously, my mother is worth a ton of money, and so by default, she is a target. But she really didn't get out much. She didn't really engage with the Monaco social scene. She pretty much just worked all the time and looked after the family. Like, she just kept to herself. So I certainly can't think of anybody that would have wanted to harm her. When Frizon turned to Wojciech, Wojciech seemed equally mystified by this whole thing. He told Frizon that he and Sylvia had been together for 28 years and they had a daughter together. And so, he knew Helen very, very well. And he said that, his relationship with Helen had always been great and that Helen generally was like this incredibly generous person. Especially really with him and with Sylvia. He said that even though he had his own businesses and his own income, totally separate from the Pastors, Helen still would give him and his family money. The mention of finances, though, made Frizon perk up. And so he asked Wojciech to be more specific about the type of financial generosity he was describing. And when he asked that question, Frizon noticed there was this look of uncertainty that crossed Wojciech's face. And for a second, Frizon wondered if he had just touched on something that was kind of a sore spot. But Wojciech went from looking uncertain to sort of recovering very quickly, and then an easy smile came across his face, and he explained that Helen gave her daughter and son, so Sylvia, his girlfriend, and Gildo, a monthly allowance of about 500,000 euros each, which was around 600,000 US dollars. When Frizon heard this, he had to force himself not to reflexively raise his eyebrows, because this was like a staggering amount of money to get every single month as just an allowance. It was so high, in fact, that it made Frizon doubt whether either of Helen's children would feel a need to kill her. If she's already giving them this much money every month, what else do you need? But Wojciech wasn't done. He cleared his throat and sort of shifted in his seat like he was uncomfortable. And then he said that, he and Sylvia used this very generous amount of money that Helen gave them on household expenses. But, Wojciech said if he was being honest, he'd heard that Gildo spent it on other stuff. Wojciech said, Sylvia's brother, Helen's son, he owned some companies that were not doing well. And so he was in very deep debt. For Frizon, he couldn't tell if this was true or not, but it certainly opened up a new investigatory door. So he jotted down this information on his notepad. He was actually meeting with Gildo next. And so if Wojciech was right, then this debt was definitely a huge red flag. 45 minutes later, when Frizon walked into Gildo's hospital room, he was shocked by what he saw. Now, he had known that Gildo was sick, but he really hadn't been prepared for just how sick. Gildo could barely move or speak. The only way he could communicate was actually by blinking. But nonetheless, Frizon sat down by his bedside and began with a few simple questions. It took a long time for Gildo to blink out his answers, and he really couldn't communicate really anything more than a few words at a time. And it was also just kind of obvious to Frizon that even with these short answers, he just was not going to get much. And as time was going by, Gildo was just getting more and more frustrated with basically his lack of being able to contribute much here. And so by the time Frizon left the hospital, not that long after he had arrived, he was very doubtful that Gildo was really in any shape to be planning a hired hit. The guy really was just not doing well. But, it was still possible, at least Frizon thought it could be, that Gildo had begun preparations before his stroke, which had only happened 2 months earlier in March. And Frizon realized the amateurish quality of the hit itself could have actually been a product of Gildo's illness, like he had to rush the hit because he basically could barely communicate. So far, Frison thought this case was basically full of contradictions. One of the richest people on the planet had almost been assassinated by shockingly unprofessional hitmen. Both of the children, both of Helene's kids, stood to inherit billions and billions of dollars and were therefore the most obvious suspects. But at the same time, both kids were receiving an ungodly amount of money already. Like they didn't need the money. And I mean, even if Gildo was in debt, the idea that $500,000 every month isn't enough to at least keep you afloat just seems sort of fishy. And so Frison began to wonder about Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Could he have planned the hit? Because he, not Sylvia, wanted access to Helene's money? And so Frison pulled out his phone and he called Massinio, the very talented detective, the best in the city, and he told her about, what he saw as issues about having Sylvia and Gildo as suspects. Massinio completely agreed with Frison. And then she shared something that she had learned during her own interviews about Wojciech. She said that one of Helene's friends told her that Sylvia had been with Wojciech so long, 28 years, without getting married because Sylvia wanted to make sure her inheritance went to her or her child or just stayed within her direct family bloodline and didn't go to an outsider, to a husband. Frison considered what this meant. It told him that Sylvia didn't completely trust Wojciech, but it also tanked his theory that Wojciech might have planned the hit, since he had zero claim to the Pastor estate, whether Helene was alive or not. But then Massinio said something else that made Frison stop thinking about the Pastors completely. She said she had found something out about Helene's driver, Mohammed. Mohammed was apparently involved in a love triangle, and had been for years. He was from Egypt, and he had a family there, but he also had a mistress here. And Massinio had gotten the number for Mohammed's adult son who lived with him in France, so they could just ask him about it. And so as Frison hung up the phone, his mind was spinning. I mean, this whole time, he had thought it was so obvious who the target of the hit was. It had to be Helene. She's this billionaire. It's got to be her. But now he was wondering if maybe the real target was Mohammed. That afternoon, Frison was back at the station with Massinio. It had been 24 hours since the shooting, and neither of them had slept. But Frison did not think they'd be able to do that anytime soon because the security camera footage had just arrived. And Frison had put a lot of stock into this footage. Like he felt really hopeful that this was going to be what they needed, because it felt like every other lead he had tried to follow so far in this case had already hit some kind of dead end. He'd just gotten off the phone with Mohammed's son, Wissam, who he had hoped, might shed some light on the possibility that Mohammed was the intended target of the attack. But Wissam had been skeptical. He did not think the lead about his father's love triangle meant very much. He said the mistress had been a part of Mohammed's life for a long time, and to be honest, nobody was particularly upset about it. Now, unlike Sylvia and Gildo, Wissam was a young and healthy man, so theoretically he could have been one of the shooters. But Frison hadn't heard anything in their call that made him think Wissam wanted to kill his father, or Helene for that matter. So now, Frison and Massinio began scrolling through the security footage, looking for clues that could maybe point them in the right direction. When they got to the point in the recording where the shooting actually happened, they were relieved to see they did have a clear view of the scene, and they watched it play out right in front of them. And just like the witnesses had said, Helene's car is seen turning out of the hospital parking lot, and then a man with a shotgun approached her window and fired twice. Frison could see that the second man watched the whole thing from across the street at a snack bar, probably acting as a lookout, and then after the shooting, both men ran away on foot, and their faces were never visible in the footage. And so Frison rewound the tape to see when these men arrived, and he saw they showed up about 20 minutes before the shooting. But it was not when they showed up that was particularly significant. It was how they showed up. When Frison saw how they arrived, his jaw dropped, because finally he'd found the lead he could follow. Both men were separately driven to the hospital in taxis, and one of the taxi's license plates was clearly visible on screen. That evening, Frison, Massinio, and a group of officers burst into the lobby of Hotel Azur in Nice. In Frison's hand was a photo of both of the shooters. After calling the taxi company, everything had moved very quickly, The taxi dispatch had a record of these two men's rides and gave detectives the mobile numbers that were used to book each cab. And it didn't take long for Frizon's team to connect those numbers to two burner phones that were purchased just hours before the shooting at a store about 2 hours away from the hospital in a French city called Marseille. And then, by using closed-circuit camera footage, the police have been able to track the shooter's movements prior to the shooting. First, as they left that store with their burner phones, and then as they boarded a train to Nice, and then stopped at Hotel Azur before getting taxis to the hospital. So, that's why Frizon and his team were at the hotel now. In order to find out who planned this attack, they needed to ID the shooters. They were hoping somebody here could. So, Frizon approached the reception desk with the picture of the shooters and asked the person manning it if they had seen either of the men in the photo. And the receptionist said yes. Those men had rented 2 separate rooms just the day before, but they had already checked out. And so Frizon wrote down the names the receptionist gave him for these 2 men, but the names were not familiar. Then, Frizon and Massinio split up to actually go search the rooms. Moments later, Frizon and some officers hurried into a very clean hotel room. And the receptionist had told him that this was going to be the case, because the maids had already been in and out of that room. They had cleaned it. And so for Frizon, even though he did expect, a clean room, it was still disappointing to walk in there and see it, because, had there been any evidence still in here, by now it was very likely gone. However, just then, he heard one of his officers call out from the bathroom. And so Frizon went in there and found one of his officers pointing to where a used bottle of shower gel sat on the side of the tub. Frizon couldn't believe it. I mean, he knew no other guests had been in this room since the shooters had been, which meant that gel was almost certainly theirs. The maids must have missed it during their cleaning. And so Frizon told the officer to bag it. I mean, it was a long shot, but he wanted to maybe get it sent off and tested for DNA. On May 16, 2014, investigators Frizon and Massinio paced around Frizon's office. Every now and again, they glanced at a document that was sitting on the desk. It had only been 10 days since Helen Pastor and her driver, Mohamed Darwish, were shot outside a hospital in Nice, France. Helen was still alive and in a coma, but Mohamed Darwish had died, which meant Frizon was now officially leading a murder investigation. Now, this was daunting for Frizon, but at the same time, he felt like they were close to breaking this case, because that document on his desk told him that the shower gel they collected during a search of the shooter's hotel rooms actually did have DNA on it, and it had matched to someone in their system, a 24-year-old man named Samin Saeed Ahmed, and through a series of phone taps, they'd also managed to figure out the name of Samin's accomplice, a 31-year-old man named Al-Hayir Hamadi. Now, these names were different from the ones that the hotel had given Frizon, so clearly the men must have used pseudonyms when they checked into that hotel. Now, both of them did have prior criminal records, but like Frizon had suspected, they were not like professional killers. They were just petty criminals and drug dealers from a neighborhood in Marseille that had the highest crime rate in the entire country. So it sort of did make sense that 2 men from that area might agree to carry out a hit for money. But what didn't make sense to Frizon or Massinio was how Samin Saeed Ahmed or Al-Hayir Hamadi could possibly be connected to anybody in Helen's life. The Pastors and their inner circle were some of the richest people in the world. If any of them were planning a hit, Frizon would have expected them to hire, more experienced and professional assassins. So now Frizon wondered if maybe they needed to take a closer look into other areas of Helen's life, like maybe her tenants, to see if anyone had obvious connections to Marseille. He knew from speaking with Helen's friends that she often handled many of her tenants personally, and so it was possible that maybe there was a feud or dispute that they just didn't know about. However, thousands of people lived in Helen's buildings. Going through that list would be nearly impossible, which was why Frizon and Massinio had decided that the best way to approach this whole thing was with a method Frizon called the fishing rod. Instead of arresting the shooters, Samin and Al-Hayir, they would watch them and keep their phones tapped and see if they led police to whoever hired them. However, while they were figuring all this out, Frizon's phone suddenly rang, and when he answered it, he got very unexpected news. It was the hospital. Helen had woken up from her coma. And so first thing the next morning, Frizon sent Massinio to the hospital to interview Helen. And then after sending her out, Frizon waited anxiously at the station for her to return. He was hoping that Helen could simply tell Messinio who wanted her dead, and then they could just close the case. Easy. But when Messinio came back that afternoon, she did not have good news. Helen had told Messinio that she was terrified, and she had lots of things that she wanted to tell the police. And at one point, she seemed like she was on the verge of actually, giving Messinio a name or just something really meaningful. But then she'd literally just struggled to breathe, and medical staff had rushed in to stabilize her, and they hadn't been able to finish the interview. Frizon was so disappointed. I mean, they'd been so close to maybe hearing the truth directly from the mouth of their victim. And now they might never know. It would turn out 4 days later, before the police ever had a chance to have another interview with Helen, she died. Two weeks after Helen's death, so in early June of that year, Frizon parked his car and began to walk into the station to start his day. And he was feeling incredibly anxious because Helen and Mohammed's case had really stagnated, and Helen's death really only made the public pressure on him and his team way more intense. Frizon still had his team watching the shooters and tracing their phone calls, but so far they hadn't gotten any more leads from that. They were also slowly chipping their way down the list of Helen's tenants, but so far they hadn't found anyone with the kind of motive they were looking for. Frizon had not totally eliminated his first suspects, which were Gildo, Sylvia, and Wojciech, but he just didn't feel like any of them stood out above the rest. Gildo potentially needed a windfall because of alleged money problems, although Frizon had not confirmed that with bank records. But Gildo's poor health made it extremely unlikely he could have planned this hit. Then there was Sylvia, who was entitled to an enormous inheritance from her mother's death, but she already had a massive monthly allowance when her mother was alive and really did not seem desperate for cash at all. And then as for Wojciech, he wasn't even married to Sylvia, so he literally had no legal claim to the Pastor estate. So Helen's death really didn't do him any good. So all this was sort of going through Frizon's mind as he stepped inside the station. And as he did, right away he saw Messinio come running towards him carrying a piece of paper. And this paper was covered in lines of numbers that Frizon immediately recognized as a call log. And Messinio explained that they had traced one of Al-Hayir's recent calls and finally found a link to Monaco. The guy he called was somebody named Pascal Doriac, and unlike the shooters, Pascal had direct ties to Monaco. He was a personal trainer, and some of his clients were elite families who lived in Monaco. And a few of those clients were also people that Frizon and his team had examined in connection with the murders. Frizon grabbed the piece of paper and read and reread its contents before he finally looked up at Messinio and said they needed Pascal's phone records right now. Later that same day, Frizon was sitting at his desk staring at a name written on a piece of paper. He had gotten access to Pascal's phone records, and he discovered that every time there had been a significant event in this entire case, like on the day of the actual shooting or the days of Mohammed or Helen's death, Pascal had texted the same number. And now that Frizon knew who that number belonged to, he realized he had been at least half right the whole time. These murders were about money. Based on the police investigation, multiple confessions, video surveillance, and bank records, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helen Pastor and Mohammed Darwish on the evening of May 6, 2014. Around 7 p.m., the hitman named Samin Saeed Ahmed strode toward Helen's black van. And as he did, he could see her terrified face through the passenger side window as she realized what he was carrying, a shotgun, and she looked at her driver and screamed at him to drive. But before Mohammed, the driver, could hit the gas, he had raised his shotgun and fired twice into the passenger side door. And then Samin just stood there and watched as Helen and Mohammed sort of slouched forward in their seats and began to convulse. Samin didn't know who the people were he just shot. But he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the payday he was about to receive for doing this. After a moment, Samin was convinced that he had been successful, that Helen and Mohammed were dead. And so he turned and sprinted away as fast as he could, knowing that his accomplice, Al-Hayir, would follow shortly after, just like they had planned. And so Samin, as he ran away, he pulled his baseball hat down over his eyes, hoping that would be enough to avoid any cameras that might be in the area. And he ran through the streets of Nice, eventually slowing to a walk before going inside of his hotel, where once he was inside, he went to his room, sat on his bed, and he called the man who hired him. Across the city, Pascal Doriac, the personal trainer, heard his phone ring, and he politely told the client he was with that he'd be right back. He then grabbed his phone and hurried out of the personal gym he had just been in, and he stepped into this grand marble hallway to take the call. And what he heard on the other end of the line was Samin telling him the good news, that the job was done. Pascal smiled, he hung up, and then he began typing out a text message. This text message was for the real killer. That is, the person who'd actually ordered the hit in the first place, to let them know that everything had gone off without a hitch. Seconds later, the real killer looked down and saw they had just gotten a text message, and it was from Pascal, their trainer. And as soon as they saw that, their heart began to race. They were very nervous about what this text was going to say. But eventually, they scooped up their phone, and they opened the message. But when the real killer read what was on their phone, they felt this enormous sense of relief that they hadn't felt in years, because their plan sort of unbelievably had worked. Then the real killer just sank back down in their comfy, expensive couch and looked out their window at an amazing view of the Monaco harbor. It would turn out Sylvia's boyfriend of 28 years, Wojciech Janowski, was lying about everything. It was Wojciech, not Gildo, who was drowning in debt. Wojciech claimed to be this very successful businessman, but in reality, all the companies that he was involved with were failing and in deep financial trouble. This had been going on for years, and Wojciech had just been swindling his girlfriend Sylvia out of her assets and monthly allowance to stay afloat. And when Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, he panicked. They weren't married, so if she died, he'd lose everything. But he believed if Sylvia inherited the family fortune all at once, he could easily steal it from her and wipe out his debts. Wojciech had also been lying to investigators about his relationship with Helene. The reality was, they hated each other. Helene was very suspicious, rightfully so, that Wojciech was after the Pastor family fortune. In 2018, Wojciech was found guilty of murdering both Helene and Mohammed and was sentenced to life in prison. The other accomplices, Pascal Doriac, Samin Saeed Ahmed, and Al-Hayir Hamadi, all received between 22 years and life in prison. As for Gildo, he would eventually recover from a stroke and he moved to the United States, while Sylvia, at least as of 2025, is still alive, and she would give Mohammed's son a job and let the Darwich family live in one of our family's properties. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the morning of April 29th, 1963, a woman named Sofia Perez was riding in the passenger seat of her car, her husband Julian was driving, and they were traveling down a narrow city street in Sevilla, Spain. It was a Monday, but Julian, who was the primary breadwinner, he didn't have work that day. And so the couple had decided, since it was such a beautiful spring day as well, that they would get out and go on a nice drive and just spend some time together. And for Sofia, this was like a perfect day. She adored her husband, and she really loved the city of Sevilla. All the people there were so nice and friendly, and it was such a beautiful place that this was shaping up to be really a tremendous day. And so Sofia and her husband, they are all smiles as they continue driving down this road. Sofia, she's looking out, taking in the sights and the sounds, and then at some point, she just has this inclination to pull out her lipstick and, apply her lipstick. And so she reaches down and she grabs her purse, which she brought with her everywhere. She was a very organized person. And she opened it up and she's rifling through it and she finds her lipstick, and then she grabs the rear view mirror and she turns it and she uses it to apply the lipstick. And as she's doing this, she begins asking Julian, hey, what should we do for the rest of the day? Beyond this drive, what else should we do? And as she's sort of half looking at the mirror and half looking at Julian, she sees a blur of motion out in front of the car. And then she turns and she realizes there's someone in the intersection that they're going to hit. It's a guy on a motorcycle And before she could say anything, Julian is swerving hard to the right to try to avoid this guy. It's like absolute madness. And then the motorcyclist, he tips over and he goes into a slide. And then Julian and Sophia, they ram off the road onto the sidewalk and smash into this huge pole. And pretty much right away, Sophia, after the car had come to a stop in front of this huge, metal pole, Sophia began like patting herself down to sort of assess the damage, to make sure she was okay. And then she looked over at her husband, Julian, who was sort of doing the same thing, and they realized that, obviously despite the horribleness of this crash, that they were okay. But then their attention turned to the motorcyclist, because even though Julian didn't hit him, they narrowly missed him. He swerved away and they crashed into this pole. Despite that, one of the last things Sophia saw before they swerved is the motorcyclist had tipped over and gone into a skid, so they had no idea if he was okay or not. And so Sophia and Julian, they carefully climbed out of their pretty wrecked vehicle, and again, they stood and kind of checked to make sure they really were okay, because now they're standing for the first time, but, they're okay. And they walked a little ways, across the street to this other sort of side street where the motorcyclist had skidded off to. And right over there, he was standing. The man who was on the motorcycle, he was standing next to his bike. And, obviously his bike had had some damage done to it, but the motorcyclist, he looked unhurt as well. So this was like an enormous, in some ways, stroke of luck. Obviously, it was bad to get into the accident, but all three of them appeared to be okay. And so Sophia and Julian, they walk over to the motorcyclist, and, the three of them were really amicable. I mean, the motorcyclist understood that, accidents happen, thank goodness nobody was hurt. And just for a few minutes, the three of them just chatted and sort of just talked about how lucky they really were here, and they exchanged information, so they could cover the damages if they needed to of the respective vehicles. And as they're just sitting there having this, relatively calm and just normal conversation here, Sophia looks over at Julian and she realizes, he was basically unhurt, but not entirely unhurt. He had this scratch on his face that was bleeding a fair amount, that very likely was from the crash. And even though by no means is this like life-threatening or anything like that, Sophia was not at the moment talking to the motorcyclist, and so she figured she would just go back over to the car and grab her purse, because she's very organized and she has something in that purse for every situation. She figured she very likely had like a bandage or something she could use to clean up her husband's cut. And so she told her husband and the motorcyclist she was gonna go get her purse and go grab a bandage or something. She goes over to the car, which is still, smashed up on the side of the road, of course, and there's a little bit of a crowd of people sort of, relatively nearby, kind of assessing the scene. She makes her way around towards the passenger side because her purse was still in the car, in the passenger seat. And as she was coming around, getting ready to reach through the open door to grab her purse, which was sitting right there on the seat, something happened. Like, she got close enough to the car where suddenly she felt this intense pain all through her body. And then it was like she couldn't even move. And she found herself falling towards the ground, looking up at the sky, and her muscles are beginning to spasm. And the last thing she saw was her husband and the motorcyclist running over to her. And then to her horror, as she's laying there looking up at them, they too began to sort of seize up and spasm and fall to the ground right next to her. It would turn out that when Julian swerved to avoid that motorcyclist and crashed into that pole, neither he nor Sophia realized that that pole was actually connected to a power line that held up electrical lines carrying a huge amount of electrical voltage. And during the crash, a few of those lines from the pole had been knocked down to the ground, and they fell around Sophia and Julian's car. When the couple first got out of the vehicle, they sort of miraculously avoided stepping on those lines. And if they had just stayed over there, with the motorcyclist and just hadn't gone back to the vehicle, they would have been fine. But Sophia, whose purse always had exactly what she needed, was in the car, and she wanted to get it and get that bandage. And so when she went back, she stepped on one of those lines and she was electrocuted. And so she's on the ground, she can't move, and her husband and the motorcyclist, they see this happening, they hear it happening, and they run over unaware of the danger, and they too are hit by those electrical lines. They fall to the ground, and all three were electrocuted to death. On January 11th, 2018, around 10 a.m., 55-year-old Ray Wright sawed through a wooden board inside of his workshop, which was located about 20 minutes outside of Rockland, California. Now, Ray had only just begun his workday, but he was already covered in sawdust. However, he barely noticed, because this was just a normal part of his job as a carpenter, something he absolutely loved. He loved his career. In fact, Ray really just sort of loved everything about his life and sort of how it was going these days. And that had not always been the case. So about 6 years earlier, Ray was in a very different and much worse place in his life. He'd been recently divorced and had started drinking a lot, and he'd spiraled, further and further out of control until one night he'd gotten really drunk and then hopped behind the wheel, and he caused a terrible accident when he crashed head-on into another vehicle. Now, Ray was more or less okay after that crash, but he'd actually severely injured the people in the car that he had hit. And so Ray had been arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison, and he was ordered to pay a huge monetary settlement to the victims of this crash. And so really, this had been like the true rock bottom moment of Ray's life. But by the time Ray actually got out of jail, he was determined to really turn his life around and become a better person. He'd stopped drinking, and he had joined Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a very well-known support group that helps keep people sober. He'd started spending way more time with his 3 kids and also his brother Dean, and he'd been renting this particular workshop that he was in right now to revamp his carpentry business, Ray Wright Design. And then also, in addition to these specific behavioral changes, overall, Ray had made this huge effort to really shift his thinking about the way he approached life. He decided he was going to really try hard to just have a much more positive attitude in general and just try to be happier. He believed it was more of a mindset, and he really was trying hard to stay in that positive, happy mindset. However, despite these wholesale changes in Ray's behavior and his mindset, which were definitely all good, the one thing he was up against that was very difficult to change, since coming out of prison, was his financial situation. I mean, he really just didn't make a whole lot of money, despite working really hard as a carpenter now. He just didn't make a lot of money. And this really didn't just affect his life. It affected other people's lives as well. Because, he needed to make those huge settlement payments to the victims of the crash, which he intended to do. But so far, he had not made enough money to make those payments, and it was definitely stressing him out. He knew he needed to make those payments, but Ray was sort of determined that he would just continue to work really hard, continue to build up his business, continue to stay positive, stay happy, be a good person, and eventually he was sure to make these payments and everything would be okay. So in essence, Ray still had problems, but he was working really hard to just stay on the straight and narrow and do the right thing. Now, Ray blew some of the sawdust off the board that he had just cut, and he set it aside. And then, as he was about to start on the next thing, he realized one of the tools that he needed was out in his truck. So he walked through the shop's big warehouse-style doors that opened out onto a dirt driveway. So the workshop where Ray worked was in a fairly rural area with only one immediate neighbor who lived in a trailer right next door on the same property. And the person who owned the trailer was a woman named Katie. But, despite there only being Katie next door, there was still a fair amount of people just sort of coming and going around the place, like Katie's friends and Ray's clients. So the area was actually usually pretty lively. But this morning, as he stepped outside onto the driveway, it was pretty quiet. So Ray just made his way out to his truck and grabbed what he needed from inside, and then he turned and began walking back towards the shop. However, before he actually got to the shop, he heard footsteps on the driveway right behind him. 2 days later, Ray's brother Dean drove his car through some back roads as he made his way towards Ray's house in Rockland, California. Dean had just been to Ray's workshop, and now he was making the 20-minute drive back to Ray's home yet again. And the reason he was doing that is because Dean was really worried. He hadn't heard from his brother in 2 days, and neither had Ray's kids or any of Ray's friends. And this was very unusual. Dean, himself talked to Ray every single day. And he also knew that Ray was a very involved and responsive dad who would definitely not just disappear on his kids. And he was also definitely in touch with other friends. I mean, this was just very unusual for Ray. So over the past 48 hours, Dean had been increasingly getting more and more worried about Ray. He had been talking to anyone he could to try to figure out like why his brother was just suddenly gone. He'd already gone to Ray's workshop and his house repeatedly, and he hadn't found Ray or any sign of Ray or any sign of where he might have gone. And also Ray's truck was nowhere to be found either. And that was actually particularly concerning because, deep down, Dean was worried that, despite the changes Ray had made in his life to be a better person and to do right by people, he was worried that, maybe Ray had fallen off the wagon and was drinking again. Like maybe that's why he's gone. He's on a bender somewhere. Now, Dean really didn't want to face that reality. That would be like devastating for so many reasons, not to mention, if Ray was off drinking somewhere, who knows what trouble he could be in. Like he could be in a lot of trouble or hurt or something. And so Dean, by this point, 48 hours into his brother's disappearance, he's just doing his best to kind of push down this growing concern that maybe that's what happened. And in fact, it was actually that sort of nagging fear that Dean had that had kept him from going to the police and reporting Ray missing. There was just this fear that if he did that, it would sort of expose Ray if he was, not doing what he was supposed to be doing. And so by this point, Dean had held off. Now, Dean parked his car outside of Ray's house again, and he got out, and, Ray's truck was not back yet. But Dean was determined that he would just go back inside and take another look around to see if maybe he had missed something. Maybe there was some clue as to where, Ray went or what he was up to. So Dean walked up to his brother's front door and he let himself inside, and immediately Dean stopped because he smelled something. It smelled like marijuana smoke inside the house, which was really, really odd. I mean, one, because the last time he was here, he definitely did not smell marijuana smoke, but more than that, Ray, his brother, had definitely once been a very heavy drinker. That was true. But he had always hated marijuana. Like, he did not smoke marijuana. And so Dean's standing in the doorway trying to make sense of this, when from the other side of the room, he hears somebody shouting at him to leave. And he sees on the other side of the room, this man has suddenly popped up who Dean did not know, who was looking right at him, basically gesturing for Dean to get out of the house. But Dean, he's sort of like, what's going on here? He looks at this guy and he's like, who are you? Like, what are you doing in here? And the guy went very quickly from being sort of demanding to Dean to very spooked, turning and sprinting out the door, out of sight. Within the hour, a police officer with the Rockland Police Department pulled his cruiser up outside of a small one-story home in Rockland and parked. He saw a man waiting outside the garage, and as the officer got out of his car, the man rushed up and introduced himself as Dean, the person who had called 911. Dean explained to the officer that he had just seen an intruder here inside of his brother's home, and that his brother was also missing. And so the officer took down some notes, both about the intruder and also about, Dean's brother's absence and why him being gone for 2 days was really out of character. And so after the officer finished speaking to Dean, he went inside of Ray's house to take a look around and see if, there was any evidence left behind by the intruder to indicate who they were, or if there was any evidence about, where Ray was, and maybe that this intruder had something to do with Ray's absence. But once inside the home, the officer saw there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of mess or violence, so it didn't immediately seem like the intruder had robbed the place or gotten into some kind of physical fight with its owner. But still, the officer left the property and went back to his cruiser and called it in. And so over the next few days, the Rockland Police Department sort of led 2 parallel investigations. There was the investigation into this intruder inside of Ray's home, which really wasn't going very far. They had very little evidence. There was barely a description of this guy from Dean, who did not get a good look at him. And then the other investigation was into Ray's disappearance. And there was definitely some thinking that the intruder and Ray's disappearance could be connected, but as of right now, they didn't know. But with regards to Ray's disappearance, after the police had spoken to Ray's family and friends, they determined that no one had seen or spoken to him since January 11th. That was like the first sort of hard date and hard fact that they had. They also checked into Ray's bank account and phone activity, and they learned he hadn't used them since January 11th, when apparently he went missing. But beyond those details, like as the weeks went on, really nothing else came in, not about the intruder or about Ray. Then on January 21st, so 10 days after Ray went missing, the Rockland Police Department got their first, big new lead. And that was Ray's truck had been found. he was not in it. It had been found totally abandoned in this apartment complex that was not far from his workshop. A couple of months later, on an afternoon in late March, Rockland Police Sergeant Zach Lewis sat at his desk at the station going over Ray's case file for what he felt like was the millionth time. So, since finding Ray's truck, basically no new leads had come in. And even that, the finding of Ray's truck really had not been the break that the police had really hoped it would be. The truck was basically in decent working condition. The only thing that really stood out was the plates had been taken off of it. But after they searched the truck extensively, they basically didn't find anything. Nothing that gave away what happened to Ray or where he was or, whether or not this intruder had something to do with Ray. It just really didn't go anywhere. So Sergeant Lewis was feeling pretty stuck when it came to this case. And so right now he was just looking through the information they already had on this case to see if maybe he had missed something. However, as he began doing this, another officer ran through the station towards his desk, waving around some sheets of paper. And this officer ran right up to Lewis, and he slammed the papers down on his desk and explained that the California Highway Patrol had just sent a report over because they thought it might contain a lead in Ray's case. And here was the lead. And so Lewis is really excited. He grabs the document, and he sees it's a report. And it's about this van that had gotten in an accident at the end of January, a few miles south of Rockland in Sacramento. The driver of this van had been extremely drunk and was going over 100 miles an hour when he crashed. And somewhat miraculously, nobody got hurt, including the driver. And so the driver, he survives, and now he's facing all these charges of drunk driving and reckless driving. But the reason this report was sent over to Rockland was because the driver was a man named Victor Gray. That's what his license said. So after the crash, the police discovered that the license plate on the van that Victor had been driving was definitely the right license plate. However, the registration stickers that were on the license plates were not the right ones. Basically, Victor or somebody had taken stickers from some other vehicle and put them on this van's plates to give the impression that their vehicle, this van, was registered. But when they tracked those registration stickers, they discovered those stickers actually belonged to Ray Wright's abandoned truck. Now, Rockland's police department knew this was a huge lead, and they could not screw it up. And so they wanted to make sure that they handled, whatever they did next exactly right, and they leveraged whatever resources they could get. So, over the next few weeks, Lewis and his team reached out to the FBI to help them process Victor's van and collect any potential evidence that was associated with Ray's disappearance. And a little over a month later, on May 8th, 2018, Lewis stood with a few of his other officers in a parking lot not far from Rockland, watching as a team of FBI agents searched Victor's van. Now, by this point, they had discovered that this van not only had Ray's registration stickers on it, but also inside of the van was a lot of Ray's stuff. They had found Ray's glasses, which were smashed. They had found Ray's cell phone, which was also smashed. They found his wallet. They found a hat that said Ray Wright Design on it. And critically, they found Ray's rain jacket, and it was covered in blood and partially charred, like it had been burned. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious to investigators that Ray was not just missing. He didn't just, go off the wagon and start drinking again and go disappear somewhere. No. He very likely had been killed. And very likely, this guy Victor Gray had something to do with it. But the problem was, there was no obvious connection between Victor Gray and Ray Wright. They were total strangers. And when they tried to speak to Victor, to interrogate him, to try to get him to open up and explain if he had something to do with this, if he knew who Ray was, Victor was not talking. So that was a total dead end. And so now investigators were just hoping that, whatever evidence they found in this van, that once it was, sent off and analyzed, that hopefully that would sort of maybe begin to explain what actually happened here. Was this just a random robbery gone wrong? Victor was just robbing Ray and it got violent? Or was it something else? Or who knows what? They just didn't know. Now, Lewis watched as the FBI agents wrapped up the search of the van and they began packing things up, so it was clear they had sort of pulled all the evidence they were going to pull. And, Sergeant Lewis and his team, they were about to leave when suddenly one of the FBI agents who was searching the front of the van in the front two seats, he began waving his arm like he had found something. And so Lewis and the others, they go running over and they look inside the van, and this agent is pointing down to like the center of the front of this van, basically near the center console. And there was this little space underneath the center console that apparently nobody had looked in yet. And inside of this little space was another cell phone. 5 months later, on an afternoon in October, Lewis pulled his cruiser into the dirt driveway right outside of Ray's workshop. But when Lewis and the other detective that he was with got out of their car, they ran past Ray's workshop and went to the trailer next door, where Lewis knew a woman named Katie Barnard lived. And so Lewis stood back as the other detective knocked on the door of the trailer, and a few seconds later, a very timid-looking woman, Katie, came to the door and she asked what was going on. And when Lewis explained to her why they were there, Katie went from looking timid to looking downright terrified. And she just began to shake, like she clearly understood why they were here. So they took her down to the station, and pretty much as soon as she was sitting inside of an interrogation room and they began asking her questions, Katie just completely broke and told them everything she knew. So ever since Ray got out of prison for that drunk driving accident, he really had been single-mindedly focused on trying to be a better person and not letting his rock bottom moment sort of ruin his life. And he'd done a great job doing that. He'd gotten sober, he'd begun, spending much more time with his family. He was like a very present father now. He was very well liked in the community. However, even though Ray, had good intentions here, the reality was he was just sort of focusing on rebuilding his own life. He wasn't really trying to help other people. Like his post-jail efforts were sort of all about him. And his self-improvement journey had really not been beneficial for everyone, because Ray had really not truly atoned or done right by the person he had hurt the most, one of the victims of his drunk driving accident, a man named Bob Manor. Bob had been absolutely furious with Ray after the accident because the accident had severely injured him, Bob, to the point where Bob had a permanent limp. And then Ray had stopped making those court-mandated settlement payments to Bob. He was supposed to, but he just wasn't making them. And so Bob is like incensed. It's like, how dare you? You hurt me, you hurt my family, and you're not even paying for it. Like, jail isn't enough. And so for Bob, it became like an obsession that he really wanted to get his revenge on Ray. And it just so happened that Bob was not just a guy with a grudge. Bob was a very violent drug dealer as well. So this was a really big deal for him. So basically, after Ray got out of prison, Bob began obsessing over where Ray was. Like, he wanted to literally discover his address so he could physically go and take his revenge, but he couldn't find Ray. He could not find the information. No one was going to give it to him, for this reason exactly. And so he was just furious all the time. He wants to find Ray, but he has no way of knowing where he lives. Then, just by pure happenstance, Bob ends up dating a woman named Katie Barnard, who just so happens to live in the trailer right next door to the shop in Rockland, California, where Ray worked. And, Bob had no idea. He's just over visiting with Katie all the time. And one day he looks out the window, and who does he see walking out of the doors of that shop? Ray Wright. After that, and you have to understand that some of this stuff actually was never fully explained, Bob hired a man named Victor Gray to kidnap Ray for him, because he wasn't going to do it himself. He needed to catch Ray off guard. And so Victor Gray kidnaps Ray, and he apparently brings Ray to Bob so that Bob can exact his revenge on Ray. Now, we don't know exactly what happened once Bob potentially received Ray. We don't know if Ray ever actually made it to Bob, but we do know at some point Victor did kidnap Ray, and there was definitely revenge, on the agenda. But what Bob ultimately failed to do, that got him caught and got Victor caught and got this whole thing blown up, was he didn't pay Victor for the kidnapping. So the very thing that Bob was so mad about really was like, how dare Ray do this to me and then not pay me? Well, Bob did the same thing to Victor. He didn't pay him. And Victor was also a violent person. He's a convicted felon, and he didn't take that lightly. And so what did he do? He wrote a letter to Bob, basically being like, hey, I kidnapped this guy for you, and I handed him to you. Like, I handed him over, and you haven't paid me yet. And then he took pictures of this letter, and those pictures were on that phone that was found underneath the center console of Victor Gray's van. Those pictures of this letter are what connected Victor to Bob, and then the connection from Bob to Ray was already known. And then also critically, because Victor hadn't been paid by Bob for this kidnapping, he took the liberty of not only kidnapping Ray, but he went back and stole the registration stickers off of Ray's truck, and he put them on his own van. And then ultimately, it was that led to Victor getting caught and this whole, con being exposed. Now, we actually don't know specifically what happened to Ray Wright. All we know is that he definitely was kidnapped, and that Bob ordered the kidnapping, and that realistically, Bob is a pretty violent guy. Victor's a violent guy. There's blood found all over, Ray's stuff. It seemed pretty apparent that the revenge that was exacted on Ray involved his murder. But Ray's body was never found, and so we don't really know what happened to him. However, using overwhelming circumstantial evidence, both Bob Manor and Victor Gray were both convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping, and they were sentenced to life in prison without parole. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.